Hello, I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our continuing series on the 2020 election. Between now and Election Day, we are bringing you the country's leading political experts talking about various aspects of the campaign and the election. All these events are free and open to the public. We live stream them on our YouTube station. You can see them there live or at a later date. I want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences at Washington State University for supporting this series and for its support of the Foley Institute. If you'd like more information about this series of programs or about other programs at the Foley Institute, you should like us on Facebook and you will receive information about our upcoming events. Or you can go to our website at foley.wsu.edu. So today's event is going to examine the politics surrounding voting and election reform. More than ever, questions of how Americans cast their ballots and not just who do they vote for has become a major campaign issue dividing the two political parties. In fact, for several years now, the parties have disagreed over voting reform and administration. From voter ID laws to ballot security measures, felon enfranchisement efforts, to vote by mail reforms. Democrats have generally sought to reduce barriers to voting and expand ballot access, while Republicans have generally sought tighter restrictions on voting in order to prevent potential election fraud. But the pandemic and President Trump have dramatically heightened tensions around these issues. As more and more states have moved to expand mail-in balloting processes to accommodate public health concerns of voting during a pandemic, President Trump claims this will open the door to massive voter fraud in the upcoming election. He has urged his supporters to vote twice in order to test state systems, said that ballots received after Election Day should not be counted, and urged his supporters to surveil polling places, sparking widespread concern about voter intimidation. When, where, and how Americans vote has never been so controversial. So what are we to make of the politics surrounding voting and election administration? What are the technical and legal issues involved in moving to a process where more Americans can vote by mail? What are the real concerns about ballot security? And what do we know about the partisan or other effects of mail-in balloting? Fortunately, we have a terrific speaker to help us sort through some of these questions. Barry Burden is the Lyons Family Chair in Electoral Politics and the director of the Elections Research Center at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. His research focuses on U.S. elections, public opinion, representation, and the U.S. Congress. His recent work has centered on election administration and voter participation. Dr. Burden is the author of numerous scholarly articles and books, including Personal Roots of Representation, published by Princeton University Press, Why Americans Split Their Tickets, published by the University of Michigan Press, and he co-edited The Measure of American Elections, recently published by Cambridge University Press. Barry's going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, after which I'll come back and we'll have some time for discussion. If you have questions, I encourage you to send those to me at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Again, email me at tsfoley, as in Tom S. Foley, at wsu.edu. So Barry, it's great to see you. I'm going to turn the time over to you now, and I'll be back after you're finished with some questions from our audience.
Well, thank you for having me. This is really a terrific series that the Foley Center, Foley Institute has put together this fall. So I'm pleased to be a part of what is a really excellent lineup. You all are fortunate to have this set of speakers coming through as we get closer to Election Day. As Cornell mentioned, I am here to talk to you about voting during a pandemic. And we'll just pull up the slides and get moving with the presentation. So voting during the pandemic has brought some, I think, tremendous learning opportunities and some real challenges. And I'm going to offer you a bit of a darker side of voting by mail. This presentation may feel a little strange or seem out of place if you live in Washington State and are accustomed to the well-run mail voting system that has been in place there now for a number of years. But I think today's talk will show you that Washington State is not typical of what's happened in the rest of the country, and that states are still struggling, and there are some real concerns in addition to obvious upsides to voting by mail during the pandemic. So let's talk about what's happened this year. There has been, as you all know, a tremendous interest in voting by mail. It may be the fastest and most dramatic change in US election administration in the history of this country. When states innovate or when voters change their patterns of voting, they typically occur in sort of a glacial way or over a series of years, building up new habits and new ways of doing things. This is a change that has happened basically in 6 months, and in some states, the spring and summer in a series of weeks. It has put tremendous stress on the election systems of many states, and those states have had to innovate and devote more resources to help make it possible. So this is clearly one of the major stories coming out of 2020 and will be something that continues to shape how elections are conducted even after the pandemic and after this presidential election is settled. Let me just give you a sense for how dramatic the change has been this year. What you see here are the states that held early primaries and caucuses this year, from New Hampshire, which was the very first back in February, if you can remember that long ago, up through Nevada, which was one of the first of the summer. And for each state, there are 2 dots. Yes.
Barry, I'm just going to break in for a minute. Can you turn on your slideshow, because we're just seeing the first slide right now. Oh, there you go. That's better.
Are you seeing the plot of the states arrayed along the bottom?
Yes, now we are.
Great. There may be a little bit of a lag. So you should be seeing a slide that's titled Mail Ballot Usage in 2016 and 2020 Primaries, with a series of red and blue dots. The blue dots show the rate of mail voting in the primaries 4 years ago, the red dots this year. If you did not know when the pandemic took hold in the United States, you could see it on this graph. In about mid-March to early April, you see a massive increase where voters begin jumping from voting in person to mostly voting by mail. And my state of Wisconsin was the poster child for this change. Wisconsin held its primary on April 7th as scheduled, whereas other states moved or modified their rules. Wisconsin mostly did not. And the state went from about 5% voting by mail 4 years ago to something like 70% voting by mail. And that's just in a series of weeks. This is in a state that was not designed to handle that volume of absentee voting. And a series of states afterwards, you see Ohio, Nebraska, DC, and others. This is really a radical transformation that brought with it, I think, some real challenges that I want to highlight for you today. So let me remind you all of the various steps that happen to make mail voting possible. Many of these steps are behind the scenes and not things that voters are necessarily aware of. From the voter's perspective, I think in many cases, a voter imagines that they request a ballot and it arrives and they send it back in, and it does feel like a convenience. And it is necessary during a pandemic for many of us who don't want to be exposed to face-to-face interactions. But you should know that it's a multi-step process, and because there are so many steps involved, there are more opportunities for that process to go wrong in one form or another. So here's a figure from one of the national security agencies showing the steps involved in a mail voting process as they thought about the threats that may be involved, maybe from foreign actors or others in the voting process. It begins, as it does with voting in person, with becoming registered over on the left-hand side. That's the first step. And then a second step of requesting the mail ballot application. And in states like mine, a voter ID is actually required to make the mail ballot application. So a voter either has to upload an image of something like a driver's license or passport, or mail in a photocopy of that ID in order to get the ballot. So these are steps that have to be taken well before Election Day. That then produces an outbound process where the election official needs to print the ballots, put together the packets of envelopes, and distribute those out to voters. A voter then receives the ballot and has the chance to mark it. It then gets returned by some incoming process, presumably by mail. The ballot needs to be inspected. There's an authentication process, maybe a cure process if a voter makes a mistake or there's some other problem with the envelope, and then finally tabulation, which happens in different ways in different states, and then finally reporting after all of that. So this pretty long chain of events really opens up a series of places where things could go wrong for the male voter. even if this is really viewed as a necessity during the pandemic, it does come with some risks that are not public health risks, but are risks to the voter in not having their ballot counted for one reason or another. Now, you may wonder where this history of absentee voting came from. How is it that so many voters are able to vote so easily by mail this year? Despite what President Trump has said, voting by mail has happened in the US in one form or another for a very long time. It dates back to at least the Civil War, when soldiers on both sides of that war were given the opportunity to vote by mail because they were away from home on the battlefront. And that actually sparks a series of openings of absentee voting that are related to wars and military conflicts. It's often those kinds of events that prompt states to make these sort of offers. So the Civil War really, I think, opens the idea. And so you see over time states experimenting with voting by mail or providing it to a wider range of people, not just soldiers, but others. And then it really accelerates in the 1970s and 80s. California in the early 80s becomes the first state to allow anyone to vote absentee without an excuse. So not because of military service, not because of illness or job travel or something else. Any reason you'd like to vote early, California allows that to happen. And very soon thereafter, many other states begin to adopt that, including Oregon and Washington, which begins to open the door to more direct experimentation with voting by mail. So this is something that has taken hold over a very long period of time, almost the entire history of the Republic. And yet this year, we're seeing such a massive and immediate shift to vote by mail that it really has a kind of different flavor, I think, than these long-term trends. So let me show you how voters have reacted then to these new opportunities to vote by mail. Here are surveys conducted by the federal government in each election cycle,
Barry,
asking.
Barry,
Yes,
I'm sorry, I'm
yes.
going to break in again because your slides are not advancing. We're still on the, oh, now, there we go.
Sorry about that. We are improvising today a little bit. The Zoom app was not working for me, so I'm operating through the browser, which I've never done before. There may be some miscommunication between PowerPoint and the browser. Please chime back in if there's a lag again.
Okay, we're on slide 6 right now. Is that where we should be?
It should say Figure 1, ballots cast by modes of voting over time, and there are 3 lines.
That's it.
The purple line shows the decrease in the traditional way of voting at a polling place on election day, which just a generation ago was essentially all ballots. Over 90% of voters, as recently as the early 90s, were voting in person on election day. But that has declined precipitously over time as voting early in person and voting by mail have taken off. But you see that takeoff is a gradual takeoff, the way a jet may leave a runway. It has not been the kind of steep trajectory we've seen just in this year. So as of 4 years ago in the last presidential election, about a quarter of ballots were submitted by mail, with about another quarter of voters voting early in person and the remainder voting on election day. So the patterns that I showed you in the earlier plot of voters in spring and summer primaries voting by mail at rates of 60 or 70% were things that states just did not anticipate, and where the systems that are in place, the election administration rules and practices and resources, weren't really geared to accommodate. And this is, I think, made heroes out of election officials who are trying to reconcile with the new ways of voting this year. Okay, I've advanced to a new slide, which should show you an unusual looking map of the United States.
Yeah, it's not there yet. There we go.
Okay. So here's a map of the US produced by the New York Times that shows what the rules are for voting by mail or by absentee in each state as of just a couple of weeks ago. Things are moving pretty quickly as states are updating their laws, and there are numerous court decisions. By one count, there are over 250 lawsuits related to voting and the pandemic this year. It's an unprecedented amount of litigation. So this is all subject to change. But you can see that the Times here has categorized states into 3 different types or 3 different regimes. The regime that's probably familiar to most of you is the one that Washington State uses. These are the darkest green states, mostly on the West Coast, that automatically mail ballots to all voters. California has decided to jump into that mix this year because of the pandemic. So these are the so-called vote by mail or vote at home states. And together they account for about 20% of all voters in the country. The more common method is a no excuse absentee system, or absentee voting allowed for all. That's much of the middle of the country in New England. These are the lighter blue states. That's more than half of voters, so over 100 million voters live in states with those rules. And then there are still a few holdouts. These are the yellow to orange colored states. About a quarter of the electorate require voters to have an excuse. And in most of these states, fear of COVID or belief that one may have contracted the virus is not sufficient as an excuse. So it still is very difficult to vote by mail in places like Texas, South Carolina, and Tennessee. Most of these states are in the Deep South, but not all of them. Fortunately, few of those holdouts are swing states. Texas looks like it might be competitive this year, but probably not in the Electoral College. Most of the other states are either strongly Republican or strongly Democratic. So it's unlikely that the Electoral College result will be sharply or immediately affected by these tight rules in some of the states, but there may be Senate races in places like South Carolina, Texas, and elsewhere that may be. So those are the rules heading into this year. So how much voting by mail happened in 2016? Here are data from the Election Assistance Commission. This is the national agency that was created after the 2000 election meltdown, which now collects data from across the country in a really systematic way. It's helpful for understanding the variety of practices across the states. You will remember from the earlier figure that about a quarter of ballots were submitted by mail nationwide 4 years ago. You can find that on the graph. It's pretty low here on the left-hand side of the figure. Most states are below that level. The typical pattern in a state is for about 5 or 10% of ballots to be submitted by mail 4 years ago. Oregon, Washington, and Colorado are far at the extreme on the right-hand side of the graph, with nearly all ballots, certainly all ballots being distributed by mail, essentially, and most of those coming back by mail. But even places like Arizona, Utah, again, a lot of Western states relying heavily on vote by mail. So what's being asked of states this year, who are on the left-hand side of this continuum, is to immediately become like places like Arizona and Colorado, with massive amounts of voting by mail, but without the slow buildup that has allowed voters to become educated about the process, allowed election systems to catch up with the process, and for resources to be invested. So again, one of the more dramatic changes in election administration in our history in such a short period of time. Now, the degree to which voting by mail happens is one aspect, but there is a second side to this that I now want to emphasize, and that's the degree to which these ballots are actually counted. Do they actually contribute to the vote totals on election day? You should see now another slide, which is labeled Mail Ballot Rejections in 2016. This is from the same data source from the EAC, but now the states are arrayed by the percentage of the mail ballots that were not counted in 2016. The average rate nationwide was just below 1%, so that's about a 1 in 100 chance of a ballot not being counted. You can think for yourself whether that seems like a risk you want to take and trade that off against the risk of contracting the virus by voting in person or using some other method. But even that 1% rate disguises a lot of variability across the states. There are many states on the left-hand side of the graph, some of them out west, that have very low rates of ballot rejection, less than 0.5% or 0.25%. But there are others on the far right-hand side of the graph that really have troubling rates of rejection. 4 states who are rejecting more than 5% of mail ballots. So in those states, a voter has essentially a 1 in 25 chance or a 1 in 20 chance of having their ballot not counted. That is a significant risk for someone voting by mail. Now, you may wonder, how does the previous graph, which showed the rate of mail voting, relate to this one, which shows the degree to which the ballots are rejected? Is it the states that are using a lot of mail voting that are also rejecting a lot of ballots? The short answer to that is no. So here I'm going to show you now both of those graphs you just saw put together. Along the horizontal axis is the rate of voting by mail in the states. You see Washington and Oregon off to the right, places like Tennessee, Pennsylvania over on the left, and the vertical axis shows the rate at which the ballots were rejected. That's the same data you just saw. Georgia with the highest rate, but also New York and Arkansas. And it looks here like there's actually a negative relationship between these two measures. States that do a lot of voting by mail, that are vote-at-home states, or states that provide ballots pretty easily and where voters have taken that up, are also pretty good about counting those ballots. More than 99% of ballots would be counted in most of these high mail states. And it's really the states that don't have much experience or don't use voting by mail much that have these very high rates of 4, 5, 6%. So there seems to be a sort of critical threshold that states need to cross in terms of having enough of this activity that they develop really good systems for educating voters, for validating ballots, and for working with the Postal Service to make sure that the system flows smoothly. Now, this figure shows the raw rates from the previous slide, but just to convince you that there really is a negative relationship between these two things, I'm going to show you now another version of this figure where these two rates are logged. So I've taken the natural logarithm of both of these to sort of account for the skew in the variables. And when you do that, you see that there's a very strong negative relationship between the two. Again, states like Washington and Arizona, high rates of mail voting, low rates of rejection, less than 1%. And it really is the states that are just beginning to use mail voting at substantial rates that maybe are at 5% or 10% that have these higher rejection rates. So here's the concern for 2020. These states like Oregon, Georgia and Arkansas and Kentucky are moving very rapidly from the left-hand side of the figure to the right-hand side of the figure in the course of weeks or months. But their systems may not have adapted to allow them to have the smoother process that you see in a vote by mail state like Washington. Okay, that's the rub. And states, I think, to put it gently, have varied in their ability to navigate the challenges of this year. So why are ballots rejected? These are data from the same resource, the EAC's 2016 survey of the states. The survey asked states the degree to which ballots were rejected and then asked them why. States have a variety of requirements for voting by mail. But this table shows that the reasons for rejection really boil down to three big ones. One is that the signature on the absentee ballot envelope did not match the one that was on file or that the state had on record. Many states have these kind of matching requirements or a matching process, and a non-match is the most common reason for a ballot to be rejected. The ballot not having arrived on time or missing a return deadline. In some states, that's a postmark deadline. In others, that's a hard deadline for receipt of the ballot. That's about another quarter of the rejections. And then another 20% are because the voter simply left off their signature. So about 3/4 of ballot rejections are for these three reasons. This is really concerning because in most of these cases, we presume that these are valid voters, they are registered voters after all, and that the ballot otherwise is legitimate. But because of a missed deadline, a missed signature, or a non-matching signature, the ballots are rejected. In states that have lots of voting by mail, voters and election officials have learned to navigate some of these processes to educate voters and to have better matching systems in place. But in states that are new to the process, and for voters for whom this is the first time experience, there are many more mistakes to be made. So again, a reason for concern in 2020 for states that are experiencing rapid changes. So just how much of a problem is it this year? Well, here's a story that you may have seen a few weeks ago from National Public Radio that made a lot of news. The reporters here actually looked back through all of the states holding primaries through the spring and summer and looked at the number of ballots that were rejected across the states. And the total they produced was more than 500,000, 555,000 primary absentee ballots rejected. To put that in context, in 2016, nationwide, about 1% of mail ballots were rejected. That only totaled about 300,000 votes. So in the primaries this year, when turnout is much lower than we will see in the general election in November, nonetheless, the sheer number of ballots rejected was almost twice as high as the total in the presidential election from 4 years ago. So you can really see that the number of people participating and who are new to the process and states that are trying to navigate the process in a new way are producing just a larger number of ballots that will be rejected. It's a travesty anytime an individual's ballot from a valid voter is not counted, But with numbers like these, you can also imagine the number of rejected ballots affecting the election outcome in some key swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida, and others. All right, so you should be seeing a slide that says lost votes are more than just rejections. So far, I've talked about rejected ballots that are not counted because of a lack of signature or
Barry?
lack of meeting. Yes.
Barry, we're not seeing that slide yet. There we go.
There we go. Thanks. So rejected ballots are a prime reason why a mail ballot goes uncounted, but it's not the only reason. And so I just want to point you briefly to this analysis by my colleague Charles Stewart that examines what he calls lost votes. These are votes that are lost somewhere in the system, anywhere from the time the voter makes the initial request for a ballot to the time it's returned, validated, and tabulated. And he's divided states into 4 different regimes that look a little bit like the map you saw earlier. These 4 regimes range from the strictest states where an excuse is required, that's the left-hand column, on to states on the right-hand column like Washington that are vote by mail. So the degree or ease of voting by mail increases as you go from left to right in those columns. And on the left-hand side, you see all of the reasons why a vote might be lost. Down near the bottom is that the voter's ballot is rejected. And that's what we've looked at so far in this presentation. And that's an important part, maybe the biggest part of lost votes due to signatures, lateness, or other kinds of problems. But there are other places in that chain of events where a ballot can become lost. And it's surprising, I think, to see just how common this is. The reasons you see on the left-hand side include things like the ballot request never having been acknowledged or received by the election office. That certainly happened in Wisconsin in our primary back in April. Or a request coming into an election office, but the ballot never being issued in response, maybe because the request got lost or the office was overwhelmed. There are cases where the election office says the ballot was transmitted, but the voter says they never received it. Maybe that's a problem with the Postal Service not delivering properly. Maybe it's a ballot being intercepted by someone else in the household. We don't know. And then there are cases where a voter says they received the ballot, marked it, and returned it, but it wasn't received by the election office. Again, that could be a Postal Service problem or some other issue. All of these are reasons why ballots may be lost. And you can see that as you move from left to right in these columns to the different kinds of mail ballot regimes, that the percentages generally decline. So in states like Washington that have a history and widespread use of mail ballots, all of these numbers are relatively low. But even in states like
Barry, can you hear me? We've lost your audio.
substantial number of ballots that don't get included in the total for one reason or another. And in some cases, the voter is not even aware that this has happened. And so the opportunity to cure that ballot or fix the problem just doesn't present itself. And the voters may not know even after the election, depending on the rules in their state. So you've also heard this year about challenges with the Postal Service. The Postal Service has a new director who's been under fire this year. There have been some changes to the way that the Postal Service operates in its sorting centers, its routes, and even its delivery standards. Just a few weeks ago, the Postal Service announced to most of the states that their postal standards of delivering first-class election mail in 2 to 3 days are not likely to be met, and that voters should prepare or should plan for a full week to receive a ballot once the request has gone in, and for another week to return the ballot once they've marked it. So you add together the outbound week and the inbound week, that's 2 weeks that voters need to allow to make the request and return it in states where a voter has to request. Maybe add an extra day or 2 to that for the voter to do the marking and for the election official to process it. We're about 15 days before Election Day where a voter needs to start the action. And there are actually steps that precede that. If you remember the chain of events at the beginning of the presentation, a voter first has to become registered, and may need to get ID and even to begin this chain of events. So the vote by mail system has been a tremendous fail-safe. It's been essential and really a wonderful way in which the country has adapted to the pandemic. But it does come with complications. And I think outside of vote by mail states, it's probably a misnomer to call absentee voting a convenience. It is more complicated in many places than voting in person, and requires a voter to start early and to actually cast their ballot before Election Day, giving up the right in most states to change their vote in the final days of the campaign. Now, as you also probably know, there's become a partisan divide this year in the tendency to vote by mail. Some of that, I think, is a reaction to President Trump's comments about fraud and other problems with voting by mail. Some of it is also that Democratic voters are more cautious about the pandemic because of their views about it, but also because of the kinds of places where Democrats and Republicans live. Democrats tend to be in more urban populated areas where the pandemic, I think, has been more present or more visible through the spring and summer. So for a variety of reasons, there has been a real divide between the parties in, I think, the support for voting by mail, tendency to vote by mail. It comes out in this slide in a national survey that was conducted a couple of weeks ago, asking a representative sample of Americans whether they plan to vote in person on Election Day, in person early, or by mail, broken out by party ID. And you can see that among Republicans, a majority plan to vote on Election Day in person. But as you move to the right-hand side of the graph, a majority of Democrats are on the other side. They are planning to vote by mail. Now, the numbers of people who tell us they're going to vote by mail have declined since the initial days of the pandemic. So maybe these differences are subsiding somewhat, but we've never really seen in any state differences of this magnitude between the parties. Before the pandemic, there were places where Republicans and Democrats preferred different kinds of voting with small differences. Here we're talking about radically different ways of participating in the election based on partisanship, either due to lifestyles or as a kind of a way for a partisan to cheer for their team by voting in a particular way. Now, this unfortunately has some consequences for election night. What you may have heard of described as either the red mirage that could appear on election night or the blue shift that happens thereafter. The idea is that the initial vote tallies that appear on election night, which are not official and not complete, may be more favorable to the Republican candidate, to Trump, and to other Republicans on the ballot. But in the days after the election, as more ballots are added to the total, that will move in a Democratic direction, and so favoring Biden and Democratic candidates. This shift is actually not new to 2020. It's been happening for about 20 years, as shown in this figure from a study by Ned Foley and Charles Stewart, which shows in each of these elections going back to the 1940s, in the days after the election, when votes were added in overtime, essentially to the game, did those votes tend to push the margin in a blue direction or red direction? So each of the circles in this graph is a state. For each of the election years, you should see 50 circles, bigger states indicating, bigger circles indicating more populous states, smaller circles indicating smaller ones. And what's striking is that through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even the 90s, there's really no systematic shift after Election Day. Sometimes the additional votes would push in a Republican direction, sometimes in a Democratic direction. But beginning after the 2000 election, in part because of some federal laws, specifically the Help America Vote Act, which provided for more provisional voting and other kinds of absentee accommodations, the later ballots became increasingly blue, and that meant late results that were shifting in the Democratic direction. This happened in a pretty dramatic fashion in some races in California and Arizona in 2018. It may be more dramatic in some states this year because of the tendency I just showed you of Democrats to really gravitate towards mail voting. I think we should be cautious in saying that this is going to happen everywhere. There are states where a lot of the mail ballots are going to be processed before Election Day. In places like Florida, those mail ballots will be mixed right in with the Election Day ballots, and so there's unlikely to be much of a lag or much of a shift. But in states like Pennsylvania and others which are new to this process and where absentee ballots cannot be processed in advance, there may be a significant shift. And I think it's a message to all of us to change our expectations about what we know on election night, Those results on election night were never official and never final, even if the media and candidates sometimes treated them as such. This year, I think we need to keep that in mind in a more intentional way and really be prepared for the process to play out in some key states where this kind of shift may happen. Now, one other challenge I want to mention this year is the absence of poll workers. This is from the similar data from the in 2016. Our core of poll workers in this country is older than the public as a whole. Majority of poll workers are over age 60. Many are retirees. That won't surprise. Enough workers. Localities have naturally folded up polling places and consolidated them into a smaller number of larger locations. But that too has its challenges. Let me show you a map of polling locations in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, comparing the 2016 presidential primary and the 2020 presidential primary. The shaded area you see is the city of Milwaukee proper. The white areas are jurisdictions just outside the city, but in the county. So blue dots are polling places in Milwaukee. Red dots are polling places outside of Milwaukee. 180 polling places in the city. In this year's presidential primary, you can see them there on the right-hand side of the figure. That may have been a necessary adjustment that the city made, but it had terrible ramifications in discouraging some people from voting and producing long lines that sometimes were 1, 2, and even 3-hour waits. So it essentially becomes an additional tax on the voting process and is potentially disenfranchising if neighborhood polling places are not maintained. So this leads to some conclusions I want to offer on a more positive note after this kind of somber analysis of voting by mail. Here are some solutions that states are already adopting, and I hope they will consider both this
we have about 10 minutes or so for some quick questions. So let me go ahead and ask you a few. Maybe we should begin with the question of how does mail-in balloting affect voter turnout, and does it have an impact in terms of advantaging one party over the other?
Yeah, it's a great question, a great couple of questions. I think there is a pre-pandemic answer to this and a post-pandemic answer to this. The pre-pandemic studies that I have seen, there are a variety of studies that all point essentially to the same conclusion, that voting by mail or offering no excuse absentee voting doesn't generally increase turnout, at least not in a high profile election like a presidential election. There are so many other factors that are driving turnout in a year like this that offering mail voting doesn't have much of a bonus on top of that. Where it looks like mail voting has had the biggest effect is in increasing turnout in local elections, special elections, primaries, other kinds of contests where voter participation tends to be low, voters are not highly engaged. Receiving that ballot automatically tends to encourage people and remind people, frankly, that there's an election happening. In terms of the partisan advantage, there also is not much evidence from before the pandemic that either Republicans or Democrats are advantaged. If anything, Republicans within states were slightly more likely to vote by mail, and Democrats tended to prefer voting in person. Again, that's a slight tendency, but there was really no systematic pattern where one party was advantaged. This year, I think, has changed the answers to both of those questions. It looks as though mail voting is really facilitating higher turnout, despite the difficulties of the pandemic. In those states that I showed in one of my earlier slides, if you all got to see that, turnout was quite high in April, May, and June, just at the time people's lives were really disrupted by the pandemic, and mail voting helped facilitate that. So I do think this year in particular, the innovations that states are undertaking, the new accommodations that are being provided, and just a high level of interest is really making this happen. I don't think that voting by mail is likely to advantage one party or the other this year. Democrats are more interested in using it and are exploiting it. The campaigns of the Democratic candidates are pushing it. But that is essentially voters sorting themselves out, Republicans gravitating to in-person voting, Democrats to voting by mail, rather than it causing a real advantage for one side or the other.
Right. Jim Casterlang asks about drop boxes and making them more accessible. And does that have any impact on the rejection rate of ballots or return rate of ballots?
Yes. Yeah, it does. The mailboxes, drop boxes, and other drop-off locations have become appealing because of concerns about the mail system. When a voter returns the ballot by mail and then it does not arrive in the election official's hands or doesn't arrive by the deadline, we don't know what caused that. And the Postal Service is one of the factors, but there's just uncertainty about that. And so having a drop box that you know is going to be serviced by the local election official, in most communities, these are emptied once a day or twice a day. Immediately, the ballot is then in the hands of the election office. And so it's a way for a voter to really circumvent or short circuit that last step in the voting process, which is getting the ballot back. And I think that's something that states are going to continue to invest in even after 2020.
Okay. Sulani Madison asks about, you laid out a lot of the reasons why trying to ramp up mail-in voting so quickly is fraught with problems. And so we can expect to have, much larger error rates and maybe higher rejections of ballots. And so she asks, how do we set public expectations that human error is not the same as fraud in the election?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's part of the public education that needs to happen. Election officials can do some of this by educating their voters about how the process works. The media, I think, can contribute by explaining and providing transparency about the system. And I think politicians need to refrain from making assertions that aren't grounded in fact. Some ballots are rejected because they should be rejected, because the voter in some cases has already cast a ballot and they've forgotten, or they're unsure or not confident that that ballot was ever returned, and so they submit a second one. It shouldn't be counted, and states have good systems for catching those. But the vast majority of ballots are rejected for administrative reasons that are maybe not even known to the voter. So I think there's just a public education and transparency that has to happen. Again, those things are difficult to do in a ramp up of just a few months. It's easier to do in a state like Washington or Oregon, where this has built up over a number of years.
Yeah, so Griffin Grubb asks, given the fact that so many states are moving towards mail-in balloting for this election, is it possible the United States will transition completely to mail-in ballots as opposed to in-person voting in future elections?
I don't think so. I think there are states that are going to be enticed by it and will continue to push in that direction. Again, most of the states west of the Continental Divide, I think, are really enamored of it. Red and blue states in the West are, I think, going in that direction and have been going in that direction. But there are other states, you saw there were 5 or 6 of them, that are not allowing any absentee voting for reasons of COVID. And voters need an excuse to even vote by mail this year. So if that's not going to be permitted in 2020, it's hard to see how Tennessee or Texas will immediately allow that to happen in 2024. One of the wonderful and vexing things about American elections is that federalism is built right into the system. Every state has a lot of authority to run elections as it wishes, and that means there's not uniformity across the states. And you saw that in some of the figures I presented.
Yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit about, President Trump has urged his supporters to go to polling places and actually observe and watch what's going on there. Some people, are concerned this may raise the specter of voter intimidation. But there are such things as the parties have poll watchers. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the role of poll watchers and why President Trump's comments may raise concern in the minds of some.
Yeah, there may be two kinds of poll watchers we want to distinguish here. There are citizens or representatives of parties or campaigns who are allowed in most states to go into a polling place and observe the process. I think that's a healthy part of the election system to provide transparency and to have a check on what's happening, either at the polling place or at a ballot tabulation center of some kind. So that's, I think, a healthy ingredient that is different from a lot of other democracies or near democracies. But then there's this sort of second type of poll watcher who I think is there for reasons of scrutiny and intimidation and really challenging what's happening rather than merely observing. And most states have rules on how those observers can interact with voters or what rights they have. I think those are going to be important to publicize. Transparency and openness are important principles, but also giving poll workers the right to operate in a professional manner and letting voters have privacy so that they have a secret ballot and to operate without intimidation, I think, are also important principles.
Yeah. So Aziz Makani asks about the possibility of online voting. We do everything else online nowadays. We do our banking online, we pay our taxes online, and we can do almost anything. Why can we not move to voting online? And do you think that's likely to happen in the near future?
I don't think it's likely to happen in the near future. There are some states that have experimented with voting on the web in some way, typically for overseas or military voters who have no other way to get the ballot back. If a military voter is on a submarine or on a base someplace, it may be very difficult to use the mail system to return the ballot. So states are experimenting with those in a very limited way. But really, all of the security experts in this field will tell you that there is not sufficient security in a system that allows a voter to return a ballot, to essentially cast the ballot electronically through an email system or a web portal or something else. And you might say to yourself, well, don't we do banking online? And I file my taxes online. I register for classes at Washington State online. Why can't I vote online? Well, in banking and these other fields, there are errors and fraud is committed to some degree. The banking system has a kind of an allowance for a certain amount of fraud to take place. And it passes that on to us in the form of fees on bank accounts and lower interest rates and other things. So it's part of the business model. The other difficult part of voting online is that votes need to be anonymous. Once I have marked my ballot and submitted it, it needs to be separated from me so that no one can ever figure out who I voted for. That's very different from, say, a financial transaction where both the consumer and the bank, or the seller and the buyer, need to have a record of what's happened. They have a ledger that says you did this thing, and here's a receipt, and we can all keep track. And if there's any question, we can go back to the log and reconcile it. With voting, we don't want there to ever be a log. I should not know how Cornell Clayton voted in any election. Maybe know whether you voted or not, but the way you voted needs to be completely detached. And that means that it can't be unraveled if there's any fraud or concern. So we need to get it right at the outset. And that really prevents us from jumping on the web anytime soon.
Okay. So another viewer asks about, lots of states are trying to ramp up very quickly the mail-in voting process. Other states like Washington, they've done it for years now, and it works quite well here. I'll just say, as a Washington voter. How many election cycles does it take for states to kind of normalize the process and to be able to run it efficiently and in a secure manner?
Yeah, I think a decade is a good run up.
Mm-hmm.
In Washington and Oregon, there was a lot of local experimentation with voting by mail. A county might try it when other counties were not, or it might be used in special elections. I think that's what was done in Washington early on, or maybe just in primaries. In states like Montana or California, it's being used in low population areas and then slowly making its way to larger urban areas. And so there's a lot of learning of how to streamline a process, how to educate voters, how to design ballots, what deadlines need to be set for mailing out and return, and whether ballots are going to be tabulated centrally or they're going to be tabulated at individual polling places or in counties. That takes a remarkable amount of time. That makes it all the more impressive that states have turned on a dime this year and have gone from a quarter of voters by mail to maybe a majority of voters by mail. But as I hope I made clear, it's come with some hiccups and some real challenges for voters. So we need more than 6 months and probably a number of years to do this in a kind of thoughtful way that smooths out any of the difficulties we're encountering this year.
Yeah. What about the possibility of having some national standards put into place for vote by mail systems that could guide states and help states? Is anybody working on that? Is it likely they'll get passed by Congress anytime soon, maybe after this election?
Yeah, well, if we're depending on Congress to do something, we're in trouble. But there is a bill that's come out of the House. It's actually been voted on as part of an omnibus bill that would implement some national uniform standards, mandating that every state provides same-day registration, that every state allows early voting or absentee voting without an excuse, that every state even mails out absentee vote ballots automatically, as Washington does. And a variety of other provisions. It would really be a major change to how some states run elections, but it would provide a floor that would set a minimum set of things that states need to do. States would then have the freedom to go beyond that or to have other local practices. Again, that's been passed by the House, which is under Democratic control. It's unlikely to work its way through the Senate. It would not be signed into law by President Trump, and I don't know how a President Biden, if he were elected, would think about the bill. But I think the Senate is probably the place where that piece of legislation goes to die. You may see some productive bipartisan legislating happening next year in response to things that went well or poorly this year. It tends to be after an election that Congress will get involved and try to make some fixes. The last time this happened was after the 2000 election, when there was a meltdown in Florida. We learned about voting machine problems and other things. Congress, in a bipartisan way, passed the Help America Vote Act the next year. And President Bush, Republican, signed it into law, and it has allowed states to get rid of old voting machines. It provided funding to do away with punch card ballots and replace them with paper ballots or touchscreens or other kinds of things, and to make other improvements. So I'm hopeful that Congress will do something like that, maybe in a more limited way after the presidential election has passed.
Okay. So we've gone over time just to make up for the glitch we had earlier. But let me ask you one last question, and that is, what's your greatest fear about the upcoming election? What do you fear most will happen that will be problematic?
I fear that there will be states where absentee voting fails in some significant way because of ballots being rejected for things like in Pennsylvania, a missing security envelope, which is an extra envelope that goes inside the outer envelope. There are estimates that maybe 100,000 voters would make the mistake of not including the second envelope this year. That is a key swing state where voting is going to take a while for those votes to be tabulated. There will be, I think, a temptation for the candidate who is leading initially to try to claim victory. There will be election lawyers who fly in to Harrisburg to litigate the heck out of what's happening there. And so the country then comes to focus on one state that's holding the balance of the Electoral College, and where there are now these sort of nitty-gritty disputes about the small aspects of election administration that, unfortunately, because of the Electoral College, control the balance of who wins the presidency. So it could be another version of what happened in Florida 20 years ago. Let's hope that fear doesn't come to pass, but I think it's one we need to keep our eyes on.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, I think our time is up. I again apologize for some of the technical glitches we had in our event today. Let me remind you again that next week we have Charles Franklin on Wednesday at noon. He'll be talking about modeling and polls and how we predict elections and what went wrong in 2016 if you think something went wrong, and how we should think about polls in this particular cycle. Again, if you want more information about our events, you can like us on Facebook or go to our website at foley.wsu.edu. Now, join me now in thanking Barry for a really interesting conversation and presentation. Lots of stuff to think about here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks. We'll see you all next week.